I never imagined that growing tomatoes would evolve into a full-scale war with my neighbor Karen, until I decided to teach her a lesson with Carolina Reapers. What started as a peaceful hobby quickly spiraled into a neighborhood nightmare when I noticed my prized tomatoes disappearing one by one. After spending countless hours nurturing my garden, carefully selecting heirloom varieties, preparing the soil with organic compost, and patiently watering each plant by hand, watching someone casually help themselves to my harvest was infuriating. Karen moved into the house next door about a year ago and immediately established herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed rule enforcer. She'd file complaints about everything from trash cans left out an hour too long to children playing too loudly in their own yards. When I confronted her about my missing tomatoes, she simply shrugged and claimed that neighborhood gardens are community property, a rule that conveniently didn't exist in our HOA guidelines. I documented each theft with dates and times, photographed my diminishing garden, and submitted formal complaints to our homeowners association. Their response was pathetically inadequate, a generic email reminding all residents to respect each other's property without any specific consequences for Karen's repeated thefts. After 3 months of watching my tomatoes disappear and receiving nothing but empty promises from our useless HOA, I realized traditional solutions weren't working. That's when I spotted an article about Carolina Reapers, the world's hottest peppers, and an idea began to form. If Karen wanted to help herself to my garden without permission, perhaps it was time she learned exactly what she was taking. My garden was my sanctuary, a meticulously planned 10 by 15 foot plot nestled in the southeastern corner of my backyard where the sunlight hit perfectly for 8 hours each day. I transformed what was once an unremarkable patch of grass into a thriving oasis of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The centerpiece was undoubtedly my tomato collection, a carefully curated selection of heirloom varieties I'd been perfecting for 3 growing seasons. There were plump brandywines with their rich, sweet flavor, delicate yellow pear tomatoes that my nieces loved to snack on, and my pride and joy, the rare black Krim tomatoes that had taken me 2 seasons to successfully cultivate. Each plant represented countless hours of research, care, and patience. I'd installed a custom irrigation system, built trellises by hand, and even kept a detailed journal tracking the growth and yield of each variety. According to our HOA guidelines, vegetable gardens were permitted as long as they were maintained in the backyard, kept tidy, and didn't become eyesores. My garden not only met these requirements but exceeded them. Neighbors often commented on how beautiful it looked, and I'd happily share gardening tips and harvest with anyone who showed genuine interest. When Karen first moved in 6 months ago, our relationship wasn't immediately hostile. She seemed pleasant enough during the neighborhood welcome party, though she did make several comments about how strict the HOA had been at her previous residence. I didn't think much of it then. We exchanged casual greetings when we happened to cross paths, and I even offered her a basket of fresh vegetables as a welcome gift. She accepted them with what seemed like genuine appreciation, complimenting the store-quality produce, a comment that slightly irked me since homegrown vegetables are generally superior to anything you'd find in stores, but I let it slide. The problems began in late June when my tomatoes started ripening. I noticed a few missing one morning and initially blamed local wildlife. But 3 days later, while watering my plants at dusk, I caught Karen red-handed, plucking a perfectly ripe brandywine from my garden while wearing gardening gloves and carrying a small basket that already contained several of my tomatoes. "Karen, what are you doing?" I asked, genuinely confused rather than immediately angry. She turned, completely unfazed, and responded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I just needed a few tomatoes for my salad." They looked ready to pick. When I explained that she should have asked first, she waved her hand dismissively. The previous owners never minded. Besides, gardens are meant for sharing, aren't they? That's what community is all about. I was too stunned to respond effectively, simply stating that in the future, she should ask permission before taking anything from my garden. She nodded, though her expression suggested she thought I was being unreasonable. I spent that evening researching neighborhood dispute resolution, hoping to avoid escalation with my new neighbor. The next day, I knocked on her door with a peace offering, a small basket containing several varieties of my tomatoes, along with a handwritten note explaining how much my garden meant to me and suggesting that I'd be happy to share if she simply asked first. Karen accepted the basket with a tight smile and a curt thank you, closing the door before I could say anything else. I felt optimistic that my gesture would resolve the situation. I was wrong. Just 3 days later, I spotted Karen in my garden again, this time harvesting not just tomatoes but also some of my bell peppers and cucumbers. This time, I was more direct. Karen, I specifically asked you not to take anything without permission. I even brought you some vegetables as a goodwill gesture. Her response was both baffling and infuriating. Well, I assumed since you gave me some, that meant I could help myself. Besides, you have so many, you can't possibly eat them all yourself. When I suggested she start her own garden, she scoffed, saying she didn't have time for such hobbies but appreciated having community resources nearby. It was clear that reasoning with her wasn't going to work. The next weekend, I installed a decorative white picket fence around my garden, nothing imposing, just a clear boundary marker standing about 2 feet tall. I also added a small, polite sign that read "Private Garden, please do not pick without permission." I thought this would send a clear message without being confrontational. Karen's response was to file a complaint with the HOA, claiming my fence violated guidelines about unauthorized structural additions. Fortunately, I had reviewed the HOA rules thoroughly and confirmed with the board president that my fence was within regulations as long as it didn't exceed 3 feet in height. The complaint was dismissed, but Karen was undeterred. I began finding footprints in my garden soil and noticed vegetables missing, particularly the ripest and best specimens. I started documenting the thefts with photographs, noting dates and times, and even installed a small trail camera disguised as a garden ornament. Within a week, I had clear images of Karen entering my garden at various times, often early morning or during the workday when she thought I wouldn't be home, and methodically selecting the best produce. When confronted with this evidence, she became indignant, claiming that spying on neighbors was far worse than borrowing a few vegetables. I formally reported the ongoing theft to the HOA, complete with photographic evidence. Their response was disappointingly tepid, a generic letter sent to all residents reminding them about respecting private property without specifically addressing Karen's actions. When I pressed for more substantial action, the HOA president advised me to work it out neighborly rather than escalate the situation. It became clear that the HOA was more concerned with maintaining surface-level peace than actually resolving conflicts. By August, Karen had grown even bolder. She began bringing a large basket and harvesting substantial amounts of my produce, sometimes taking nearly half of the ripe tomatoes in a single raid. When I installed a lock on my garden gate, she simply stepped over the low fence. When I raised the fence height to the maximum allowed by HOA regulations, she complained to other neighbors that I was being hostile and unwelcoming. Some neighbors, unaware of the full situation, began giving me concerned looks and asking why I couldn't share a few tomatoes with a single woman. The injustice was maddening. It was during a particularly frustrating evening, after discovering that Karen had harvested nearly all of my prized black Krim tomatoes, which I had been waiting all season to enjoy, that I came across an article about extreme peppers while searching for garden security solutions. The Carolina Reaper, developed by cultivator Ed Curry, held the Guinness World Record for the hottest pepper on Earth, measuring over 2.2 million Scoville heat units. For comparison, a jalapeno typically ranges from 2,500 to 8,000 units. The article described the pepper's heat as potentially dangerous and noted that consumption could cause intense burning, sweating, nausea, and even vomiting in unprepared individuals. An idea began to form, not as revenge, but as a way to finally establish a boundary that Karen couldn't ignore. I ordered Carolina Reaper seeds from a specialty supplier and began growing them indoors under grow lights to accelerate their development. It took several weeks of careful cultivation before I had seedlings ready to transplant into my garden. I selected a spot clearly visible from Karen's kitchen window but partially obscured by my larger tomato plants. The young pepper plants resembled tomato plants enough that a casual observer wouldn't notice the difference, especially since I planted them among a new variety of plum tomatoes I'd started. I continued to carefully document Karen's garden raids, building a case file that now included dozens of incidents. Meanwhile, I purchased a high-definition security camera and installed it under the eaves of my house, positioned perfectly to capture my entire garden area. The Carolina Reapers flourished in the late summer heat, producing small, wrinkled, red peppers that looked just deceptive enough to be mistaken for cherry tomatoes by someone in a hurry. I placed subtle markers near these plants, small, colored garden stones that would help me identify them, and waited. I made sure to be especially vigilant about harvesting my actual tomatoes promptly, leaving the Carolina Reapers as the most visible ripe options in the garden. September arrived, and with it came the perfect opportunity. I had a weekend trip planned to visit my sister, which Karen had overheard me mention to another neighbor. The Carolina Reapers were at their peak ripeness, their innocent appearance belying their fiery nature. Before leaving, I double-checked my camera setup and made sure it was recording with plenty of storage space. As I pulled out of my driveway that Friday afternoon, I noticed Karen watching from her window, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she made her move. I returned from my weekend trip on Sunday evening, immediately checking my security camera footage. Just as I'd anticipated, Karen had wasted no time. The footage from Saturday morning, barely 12 hours after I'd left, showed her confidently entering my garden with her usual basket and gardening gloves. She spent several minutes selecting the ripest-looking specimens, which, unknowingly to her, included 5 plump Carolina Reapers. The camera captured her smug expression as she admired her haul before returning to her house. I downloaded the footage to my laptop and waited. The confrontation I had expected came much sooner than anticipated. At 7:43 that evening, while I was unpacking my suitcase, a piercing scream echoed through the neighborhood, followed by what sounded like frantic running water. I knew exactly what had happened. Karen had sampled her tomato harvest. Within minutes, my doorbell rang with such force that I thought it might break. Through the peephole, I could see Karen's contorted face, tears streaming down her cheeks, her normally perfectly styled hair disheveled. When I opened the door, the smell of milk hit me immediately. She had apparently doused herself with it in a desperate attempt to neutralize the capsaicin. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse and her lips visibly swollen. "You poisoned me." I maintained a calm demeanor, though I'll admit I felt a certain satisfaction seeing her finally face consequences for her actions. "I didn't poison anyone, Karen. I simply grew Carolina Reapers in my garden, which, by the way, you entered without permission, again, to take things that weren't yours." Her face cycled through expressions of pain, rage, and disbelief. "Those weren't normal peppers." "You did this on purpose," she accused between gasps, still clearly suffering from the pepper's effects. "Yes, they're Carolina Reapers, currently the world's hottest pepper. And yes, I grew them on purpose, in my garden, which you've been repeatedly stealing from despite multiple requests to stop." I pulled out my phone and showed her the footage from just yesterday. "This is you, taking my produce without permission for the 27th time in 3 months. I've documented every incident." Karen's face paled beneath the redness caused by the peppers. You've been recording me? That's invasion of privacy." Her attempt to flip the narrative was almost impressive. "Actually, it's perfectly legal to have security cameras on my own property, especially when I'm documenting repeated theft. What isn't legal is entering someone's property and taking their belongings without permission." A neighbor from across the street, attracted by the commotion, had approached my front door. It was Bob Wilson, a retired judge who had always been friendly but distant. "Everything okay here?" "I heard screaming," he inquired, looking concerned. Before I could respond, Karen launched into her version of events, though her delivery was hampered by her need to periodically spit and wipe her mouth. He planted dangerous peppers to poison me." Bob looked confused, so I calmly explained the situation, showing him some of the footage on my phone and explaining my repeated attempts to resolve the issue peacefully. "I see," Bob said thoughtfully. "So you grew hot peppers in your garden, and Karen here took them without asking and ate them?" "Exactly," I confirmed. Karen tried to interject, but another wave of pepper-induced pain seemed to hit her, and she moaned miserably. Bob turned to her with a surprisingly stern expression. "Karen, I've been watching this situation develop for months. This young man has been more than patient with your behavior. If he wanted to, he could press charges for trespassing and theft." Karen's eyes widened in shock. "You've seen her stealing from my garden?" I asked Bob. He nodded. "From my home office window." I considered saying something, but I figured it wasn't my business to get involved. By this point, several other neighbors had emerged, curious about the commotion. As the situation was explained, the neighborhood sentiment clearly shifted in my favor. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 doors down revealed that Karen had also been helping herself to flowers from her garden. Mr. Chen mentioned missing garden ornaments that he'd spotted in Karen's backyard. It seemed Karen had been treating the entire neighborhood as her personal shopping center. Faced with mounting evidence and neighborhood testimony, Karen's indignation deflated. Between continuing pepper-induced hiccups, she muttered something about just trying to be part of the community and retreated to her house, promising loudly that she would be filing complaints with the HOA and possibly the police. Bob placed a hand on my shoulder as we watched her go. "Don't worry about those threats. If anything, you've shown remarkable restraint. Many people would have involved the authorities much sooner." The next morning brought another surprise. Karen, looking decidedly more composed but with still swollen lips, knocked on my door. When I answered, she didn't meet my eyes but thrust a handwritten note toward me before quickly turning to leave. I called after her, "Would you like to talk about this?" She paused, shoulders slumped, then slowly turned around. I was wrong," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have taken your vegetables without asking." Her apology seemed genuine, if difficult for her to deliver. I invited her in for coffee, an offer she hesitantly accepted. Over the next hour, a very different Karen emerged. She explained that she'd moved to our neighborhood after a bitter divorce, feeling isolated and resentful. Taking control of the neighborhood through HOA complaints and helping herself to others' property had been her dysfunctional way of establishing some sense of power in her new life. "It doesn't excuse what I did," she concluded, "but I hope it helps you understand." By the time she left, we had reached an understanding, not friendship, exactly, but a mutual respect and clear boundaries. The incident sparked unexpected changes in our community. The HOA called an emergency meeting the following week, where they unveiled new, clearer guidelines about respecting private property and proper channels for dispute resolution. I was asked to join the Architectural Review Committee, given my evident knowledge of HOA regulations. Most surprisingly, Karen volunteered to start a community garden in an unused corner of the neighborhood park, a project that had been discussed for years but never implemented. "Everyone should have access to fresh vegetables," she announced at the meeting, carefully avoiding my gaze, but in a way that brings the community together rather than creating conflict. The proposal passed unanimously, and within months, the community garden became a neighborhood gathering spot, with Karen proving to be an enthusiastic, if strict, organizer. As for my personal garden, I continued growing my beloved tomatoes alongside a small section of hot peppers, including a few Carolina Reapers, now clearly labeled with warning signs. Karen never entered my garden uninvited again, though she occasionally knocked on my door to politely request gardening advice or to invite me to community garden events. The following spring, she even asked if I would be willing to donate some tomato seedlings to the community garden, an irony that wasn't lost on either of us. I agreed, on the condition that proper credit be given to the grower, a stipulation that made her smile ruefully. Word of the Carolina Reaper incident spread throughout the neighborhood and even to adjacent communities, taking on almost mythical proportions with each retelling. My garden acquired a certain notorious reputation, and I noticed people giving it a respectfully wide berth when walking past. Even neighborhood dogs seemed to avoid marking my fence. The experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, the importance of clearly established boundaries, physical and social, cannot be overstated. Second, traditional authority structures like HOAs aren't always equipped to handle interpersonal conflicts, sometimes necessitating creative solutions. And finally, even the most difficult neighbors can change when faced with direct consequences of their actions. Karen and I never became close friends, but over time, our relationship evolved into something resembling mutual respect. She channeled her controlling tendencies into organizing community events and advocating for neighborhood improvements, while I found my voice in HOA meetings, ensuring that resident concerns were properly addressed. The Carolina Reaper plants remained in my garden as a subtle reminder of our history, a spicy footnote to a story about property rights, community dynamics, and the unexpected paths to resolution. As Karen herself remarked at a neighborhood barbecue the following summer, gesturing toward my garden with her glass of lemonade, "Some lessons burn more than others, but they tend to be the ones you remember." I couldn't have said it better myself.